campers, backpackers and park rangers of Reddit, what is the weirdest or creepiest thing you have found while in the woods? Not me, but a buddy found a young kid, 16 I think, in the process of trying to hang himself about 5 years ago. He was hooking a makeshift noose up to a tree. Upon seeing my friend he stopped. My buddy talked with him and they walked and talked. The lad was gay and his parents and family had disowned him when he came out to them. My buddy and his wife let him stay with them for a few weeks until he moved to a family member's house. They are still firm friends. Stories like this make me love Reddit more. Was camping in Norway during summer a couple years back. One morning while I was half asleep considering to get up or not, the tent suddenly started to shake violently. First thought in my mind was that it was a random hiker fricking around with my tent, so I shot out of the tent in my pants to confront the foe. I was greeted by over 100 caribou surrounding my tent. Turned out the bravest reindeer tripped over the lines of my bright orange high visibility tent. You were lucky it wasn't a troll. I found 2 squirrels huddled together, dead, in the middle of a field. It was July. I still think about what must have happened and draw a blank. Maybe the lightning got em mid-coitus. Not me, but one of my friends went on a solo fly fishing camping trip for the weekend. He was in the middle of a creek fly fishing and kept hearing the weird garbled sounds from up the creek. So eventually he decided to check it out when he took a break for lunch. It turned out to be a guy that had tried to commit suicide by shooting himself, but he was still alive. My friend hauled butt back to service to call 911 and had to hike back in to show the cops medics where the guy was. Never found out what happened to him, but my buddy was so freaked out that he had been that close as the dude was just laying there for hours. Deer snuck up within a couple feet behind me, then suddenly coughed. Sounded just like a human and I knew I was the only one out there. Gave me a dang near heart attack. This one made me laugh. Just to imagine that deer trying to be so quiet and then coughing like that. Sounds like something out of a cartoon. But I'm sure in the moment I would have crapped myself. When I was a kid in the mid-90s, my friends and I were hiking around in the woods behind our house on some warehouse timber property and found an abandoned farmhouse. The weird thing was that the house had been left very suddenly. There was still an opened mail and magazine sitting on the coffee table, all dated back to same date in the 1950s. Sheets and blankets still on the beds, clothes still in the drawers, pantry full of canned and jarred food, half of it exploded or leaking after so many years. Dishes in the sink, dishes on the table, unburned candles still sitting out waiting to be used. A fridge outside full of food that had turned to muck and dust. After exploring the house for a while, we checked out the farm. The chicken coop had dozens of chicken skeletons, wrapped in desiccated skins or picked bare. There were 2 pig skeletons in a pen, and the remains of a horse and several cows in the surrounding pasture. A tractor was parked in the garage and was in great shape for its age. It didn't occur to me as a kid at the time, but aside from the house having been left so suddenly, it was really remarkable that the entire place was undisturbed. There was no vandalism, no sign of entry, and as far as I could tell, we were the first people to set foot in there in 40 years. I was like 12 and lived near the sand dunes. We used to hike there all the time. My grandmother came to visit, so we both went on a hike and I see this weird circular rock in the sand. I pointed out to my grandmother and she goes over there and starts removing the sand around it, and she notices blood on the rock. She then pulls it out of the sand and it's a human skull. We reported it to the police. So what happened was that this dude was killed by his roommate and he cut him into 5 pieces and buried each part in a different location in the sand dunes. We found the last missing piece, his skull. We were on the news. Pretty cool memory I have of my grandmother. I was hiking in some woods on a property my father rented as farm ground with my older brother. After a while we noticed a sickly sweet smell. Being farm kids, we knew what it was. Something dead and left to rot. As we kept walking, we entered a marsh-like area. Soft, squishy ground and very tall grass. We had walked through marsh-like areas before, so we walked on the large grass clumps, being very careful where we placed our feet. After making it to a log clump of solid ground, I look up and find a massive pile of skinned animal carcasses. The pile was easily over 10 feet tall, with a 15-foot circumference. It comprised of every animal you could think of: rabbit, fox, coyote, deer, weasel, cat, dog, raccoon, and others I couldn't recognize. The old man that owned the land trapped year-round for anything he could get. He just kept throwing the carcasses in the same pile year after year. After we left the area, it dawned on me, the marsh was not in a lowland like most marshy places. The group was just saturated with the decaying fluids of all those animals. That's also the reason the grass was abnormally tall in that area. I've been homeless. A lot. I lived in some distant family's land where they have an old cabin up on stilts. Due to the local woods flooding heavily sometimes. Illinois is weird. Anyway, I spent a good amount of time in this old cabin. Wood stove, porch swing hanging from the ceiling that I used as a bed. Overall, it was an okay place and it wasn't too far of a drive to town for food. You just had to tolerate the half-mile walk to your car. One day I am out walking around the woods and in a smallish clearing in the path, I see easily a good 50-60 dead geese. Every one of them is mangled in horrific ways, necks ripped off of the body, bodies splayed out over old timbers and fence posts, feathers everywhere, bones sticking out of the dirt. It just looked like a straight up goose genocide. The ground was dry, and there was a lot of dust, but I saw no prints, and there was no other evidence of anything being in the area aside from what one can only assume was some sort of strange breed of exploding goose. I also found a torn open old backpack and a great deal of candy wrappers strewn about it. Way too moldy to identify anything about it. I decided to turn back and see if I could grab a camera when I start hearing this god-awful shrieking noise, as if it were coming from every possible nook and cranny within a 30-foot radius. I took off pretty fast when that started. To this day, my best guess is some sort of massive commune of foxes. It really is the only rational solution I can come to. Still scared the crap out of me. When I was a boy, my father and I came across a full set of women's clothes in the woods. Shirt, pants, underwear, even the shoes. We thought it was pretty creepy and reported it to the state police, but I don't think anything ever came of it. It was fairly close to a river, so maybe the person went skinny dipping and couldn't find their clothes after, but it was an unsettling discovery. She's naked out there somewhere. Not really camping, but as kids we lived in a new neighborhood. It was next to about 400 acres of woods and old farmland. There were several abandoned houses and barns, equipment, and random junk. It was great to grow up there as we spent nearly every day exploring the area. But there was one house off the main road, but about 200 yards into the woods. It looked abandoned, but a woman lived there. We found out the hard way by trying to get into the house one day, and she came out screaming at us to get the heck off her property. She was scary looking as heck. She wore a dirty dress and had gross stringy hair, and looked like she hadn't taken a shower for years. She looked to be in her 30s. Needless to say, we stayed away from her most of the time. We also never told our parents because we knew that they wouldn't let us play back there anymore. We did go back sometime though. We named her Crazy Mary, and we'd spy on her and dare each other to get as close as possible. Even then we never got closer than 100 feet from her house. About 10-12 years later I am home from college and my mom tells me about how they took this woman to the mental hospital. Apparently she lived there this whole time with her dead mother and father propped up in their chairs in the living room. They figured the parents were dead for 10-15 years, but died of natural causes, and Mary had propped them up in the chairs after they died. That meant they were probably freshly dead when we got chased away by Crazy Mary. Backpacking solo during the springtime, Minnesota, so it was still kinda snowy. During my first night I noticed that it was quiet. Not just quiet, but completely silent, like no sounds whatsoever. I always thought noises at night were scary, but nothing compares to utter and complete silence. I could hear every beat of my heart, every inhalation, and every twig snap in a 2-mile radius, or so it seemed. Very creepy. The Wendigo was out. Camping at Yellowstone Grand Tetons a few years ago. He set up our camper at an actual site and decided to do some 2-day-long backpack trips in some of the longer trails. The second one we went to was Cascade Valley Canyon. Absolutely beautiful. So get about 10 miles into the 22-mile loop and decide to set up our tent here since it was getting dark. We cook some food and chill for a bit before heading to bed. Around 2 AM, we are all awakened by something just outside the tent. My mind immediately jumps to bears or wolves or something. Then it starts talking. I will never forget it. I think there's 3 or 4 in the tent. Let's just get out of here. None of us could sleep the rest of the night. At the crack of dawn we hightail it out of there. Made excellent time. Hiked the 12 miles in about 3 hours and got to ranger station. Reported what happened. They said they had received a call similar to our story in the middle of the night. They sent rangers into the trail at dawn. Never found out what was going down. Didn't hear of anyone getting hurt. But then again I didn't really look into it. A large plastic storage box bound by bungee cords filled with flies and bones. Hiking with a group in a subtropical mountain range about a 40 minutes drive from civilization. It's a night hike. Pitch black but 4-hour headlamps. And all of a sudden this guy wearing headphones and a hoodie just walks past us like we're on a suburban street. It was pitch black. Where the heck was he going? What was he doing out there? It creeped the heck out of us. I was hiking in Slovenia when I turned the corner to see 2 sheep going at it. I was at about 2,000 meters elevation and hadn't seen any other people or living creatures in hours, so this certainly startled me. This also made me aware of how dumb I was being hiking alone in a country I was unfamiliar with. There are bears and crap up there, and after that I got all paranoid that the next creature I would run into wouldn't be so kind. Last spring I went fishing on a lake in northern Minnesota. On that annual spring trip we always walk in the woods around the lake and look for morel mushrooms which are in season at that time. While looking for mushrooms I came upon 2 big deer skeletons and the horns were locked together. The bones were chewed on by rodents but the horns were locked together and in great shape. We figured they must have fought in the autumn before and got locked together. I have no idea how long these 2 enemies were locked together before they died. As a native Minnesotan this happens a lot. The victor of fights is often the only one left alive and depending on how big the loser is he can't always drag the other guy away with him. Sometimes they figure out how to unlock before one dies but frequently they both die as a result. Was in Montana. We saw a park ranger and asked him which way would be the coolest. He points down into a beautiful looking valley. We head on down the trail, and a couple hours and the valley starts to funnel and get tighter and tighter. The cliffs looming up next to us. Another 20 minutes pass. We hit a clearing, and my heart drops through my innards. Going across the clearing was displaced grass similar to if a pickup truck had been driven through. Turns out the valley was called a nursery, where mama grizzly bears nurse their young. Naturally, we turned around and GTFO, making noise the whole way out. Grizzlies generally avoid people making lots of noise. Me and my father were camping on a small lake in Canada. My father said that all through the night he could hear what sounded like large rocks splashing in the middle of the lake. Several times he left the tent with a flashlight only for the noises to stop immediately. My father is an avid fisherman and was certain that it wasn't fish breaking for flies on the surface of the water. I slept through the whole thing apparently. Copy pasted from a similar question. I found a dead guy hanging from a tree out in the woods of a Korean national park. Really scared the crap out of me and the 2 guys with me. We were looking for a point and walking up a very steep hill when we rounded a bush and pretty much stumbled into this guy who hung himself from a tree. I sent them back down the hill and called up the duty desk for the nearby post. Standing up on the hill looking out at the last thing the guy must have seen just left me feeling incredibly lonely. Not creepy, but a bit weird. I took my children camping at a state park with campsites around a lake. It wasn't primitive camping, more like set up your tent with the car parked 20 feet away camping. We're sitting around the campfire after sunset making s'mores when a car pulls up to the campsite next to us. It's about 35 yards away and it's dark, so we can't see who our new neighbors are. I feel a little bad because they have to use the headlights on their car to see what they are doing while they set up their tent. I wanted to offer to help, but with children and an open fire, I thought my attention would be best used right where I was at. So later, we put out the fire and everyone goes to bed in their tents. I don't think about the campsite neighbor anymore. In the morning, just as the sun is rising, there is beautiful music coming from across the lake. It was a solo performance using low brass. The musician plays 3 lengthy songs, maybe 15 minutes of music. This gets me out of the tent so that I can enjoy the fresh air by the lake with an unexpected live performance. Once the music ends, I look over at the neighbor's campsite. I guess they are deep asleep or not impressed enough to come out the tent. I start a new fire to get ready for breakfast. About 10 minutes later, I see the campsite neighbor hiking back to his tent carrying a tuba. I'm in the middle of cooking, so it takes me a few minutes to go over and thank him for the nice early morning concert. I genuinely enjoyed it. By the time I get over to the campsite, he has already put away the tuba, packed up his belongings, and had his tent half put away. I tell him that I'm both impressed at his playing ability and grateful for the nice surprise. And then that is when I noticed it. This guy only has one arm. All of this would have been impressive for just one person to do. Setting up a tent in the dark, hiking with a heavy tuba in the dark so that you can perform a sunrise serenade, and tearing down a campsite in minutes. But this guy did it one-armed. Hats off to him. TLDR. One-armed man set up camp and get a sunrise concert with a tuba. My so's aunt is missing one arm. She cleans houses for living and does a ton of outdoor labor at her home. She makes me look like a lazy pose. When I was a kid, I went to a summer camp that would take older campers, 12-14, on excursions like a canoe trip and or a hike for about a week at a time. It was located in Massachusetts, so we did a lot of hiking along the Appalachian Trail. One hike, there was a group of about 7 girls and 2 counselors, 19-20 yo. I'll never forget, one morning we are hiking along the trail and run into a random guy who is alone, sleeping stark naked in the middle of the trail. Now, you can't camp on the trail on the at. Everyone who hikes it knows that. You've got to camp in designated areas. This guy clearly didn't get the memo, so we carefully sidestep him and continue on our way. About 12 miles later, we get to our site for the night, and this dude is already there. Weird, considering we didn't see anyone pass us throughout the day. The whole night, he's real friendly, telling us things like, "My father owns these woods." "Oh yeah, he's your father, too." Weird crap. At one point, one of our counselors mentions that the site axe is missing. It was there when we arrived, and when she went to use it for firewood, it was gone. The guy had a knife collection he was keen on sharing with us, so it was pretty clear he was the one who took the axe. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, he was gone. Terrifying. I live in Alaska, and less than 2 months ago I was hiking through the woods on my way duck hunting. I was probably less than 100 yards off the trail when I found pieces of an extremely decomposed human body. Obviously I turned around immediately and called the police. The body was torn apart by animals and decomposed enough that it took a week or so to identify it. Turns out it was a 53-year-old lady who had gotten lost hiking a mountain a couple months earlier. What amazed me was that even with an extremely extensive search for her when she went missing, she still wasn't found, and she was so close to the trail. Oh god, that happened to my ex in Colorado. He and a friend went crawling around in a cave and came face to face with a guy that had become wedged betwixt 2 very large stone sides in this cave and died there. He has been missing for months, and there was also a pretty extensive search for him. Poor guy colon. I was kayaking down a river and got to a bend where the river widened and slowed down. I stopped paddling and was enjoying the sun and the view. What I thought was stick floating down the river was actually a snake swimming across, who decided to climb up on my kayak and sun itself. I went camping with my girlfriend at a very large provincial park a week before Canada Day, several years back. When we arrived, we were delighted to find out that we basically had the whole park to ourselves, as we were told by the ranger who issued our pass. Furthermore, we were camping on an island that took about 1 hour to canoe out to, isolated with no other sites really nearby. A couple of days into our trip, we decided to take an extended canoe trip around the lake. Upon return, from a distance out, I noticed something on the shore of our campsite. As we got closer, we realized it was another canoe, which was very odd as there were no one else occupying the other island sites, and the park was essentially empty. Finally, as we were about 30 meters away, we saw 3 people poking around our stuff. They hadn't seen us yet and were just sort of enjoying looking at our campsite. After a bit they noticed us, rushed into their boat and launched into the lake. We were only a couple feet apart as they came out and we went in. I was feeling super weird, obviously, at this moment, and just said, "Hey, what's up?" Not in the friendliest tone. I got a good look at them all at that point, and they were a bunch of teens straight out of the movie Deliverance. Slack-jawed, toothless and generally unpleasant to gaze upon. They didn't say anything to us but sort of just stared, very intensely. We got to our shore and checked our stuff out to make sure they hadn't stolen anything, which they hadn't. But after the inspection I looked back to the lake and they were just sitting there a way out looking at us. Eventually they left. My girlfriend and I had a really uncomfortable day thinking about it. We slept with the hatchet in the tent and barely caught a wink as we were waiting for them to show back up. Thankfully, we didn't see them for the rest of our trip. A guy standing outside my cabin looking through the window. Welcome to PA folks. Just an Eagles fan looking for his team's Super Bowl trophy. Still looking after all these years. While hunting in eastern Mississippi I stumbled upon an old farmstead foundation complete with the family graveyard and a collapsed well. All the gravestones were dated from just after the Civil War and most were women and children. No combat age males were buried there, so I assume they died in the war and the family couldn't survive. The whole area was super creepy, especially the well. These kinds of threads are what got me addicted to Reddit. I usually hate seeing repeated AskReddit questions, but anytime it's the creepy stuff in the woods I'm like, yes, give me this crap. Years back in the Rocky Mountain National Park, there was a search for a park ranger whose car had been left at the parking area overnight when he didn't check in for work the next day. They knew roughly which set of trails he was intending to take, and my dad said, I bet I know exactly where the body is. If he took trail X, there's a spot that I've always been terrified I'd fall down. So for the heck of it we decided to hike up a different trail where we were pretty sure the body had fallen. Unfortunately, the waterfall was a bit too slick so we didn't get all the way. Later that day though, they found the body exactly where my dad thought it would be. It was a pretty clear situation where the guy died on impact, so the delay didn't really matter. Me and a buddy of mine were camping in the Pisgah forest at dusk. While we were tripping our balls off on some ego-killing mushrooms, an albino guy walks into our campsite with an albino hound puppy. Pretty crazy crap. I think he was expecting us to freak out, but since we were already floating in the ether anyway, we just took that crap in stride. We chatted this dude up and I offered him some chicken tenders and a beer. I think he was trying to have a laugh, but didn't get the desired response maybe? Long story short, we made fine friends of a shotgun carrying albino fisherman and his matching puppy. He strolled off into the dark after hanging out for a while. Fun was had by all. Moral of the story is, people begin to look like their pets after all I guess. LOL. Park ranger here. Snowmobile patrol in the backwoods past Vale Pass and came across a pair of snowboard boots and a butt print at the edge of a drop. Put search and rescue on standby before getting to the bottom to only find a helmet and nothing else. Still no idea what happened that day. Reverse heli skiing. Park ranger here. First around 11 at night I was outside our ranger base when all of a sudden I hear the barking and howling of coyotes. Multiple of them all around me, I can see and hear them running. It's odd because they don't usually band together at night, at least not in this park. I flashed a light on two of them snarling and they all ran off to the same area howling. I think they had a kill and were trying to fend me off. There was like 5 of them. Second, I have walked into the woods and it was dead silent. Someone else mentioned this in an earlier post. It is horrifying. It just doesn't feel right. It's unsettling to not even hear a bug in the pitch black woods. Third, not much to this, but we have a couple buildings and it's always freaky when a security alarm goes off. We have to clear the buildings and call it into dispatch. Sometimes animals or even the weather will set them off. Occasionally actual break-ins. Night shifts are always freaky. Are some less harmful animal stories, but there isn't much to that. Half an alligator corpse, maybe 3 days dead, by a small creek behind a developing subdivision in SE, Pennsylvania. I was maybe 9, and there was an empty sandbank by the creek where my friends and I would particularly enjoy playing around. This day I was alone. I pushed through the heavy foliage as usual, only to find myself eye to eye with a goddamn alligator. I froze in place. I was heavily into Nat Geo and Animal Planet at that age, and vaguely thought alligators to be somewhat lazy. They were always just lying around en masse in the documentaries. That doesn't mean I was good in emergency situations yet. I must have stared at it for at least half a minute before I realized it wasn't moving. And it also smelled pretty bad. This is when I looked away from its head and realized its back half had been violently torn away. There was no blood, few flies, and it had definitely not been there the day before. Just half a dead lizard, unceremoniously deposited in my favorite creekside place, but I didn't know how to process it at all, so I slowly backed out of the brush, the instinct-driven, idiot part of my brain screaming, "Are we sure it's dead?" and ran back to my nearby hidden bike. I rode straight home and played Super Mario 64 all day instead. I never told my parents, or my young friends, about what I'd found. None of us returned to the creek bank for at least a week, by which time I suppose it had disappeared. All that was left was a foul, aged odor of rot, which my friends attributed to creek scum. I knew better, though. My husband is a ranger in charge of trail maintenance at a 1,000-acre park, and spends a lot of time doing trail work deep in the woods. He makes Blair Witch twig hangings and puts them in remote spots. Thinks crap's hilarious. I think it's pretty. Tell him thanks. Was camping with a few friends in high school and there was another family in a campsite next to us. The parents seemed normal but the kids acted weird. We were probably awake until 2 or 3 in the morning with the fire going and hanging out. I go find a place to pee with my headlamp on, and then out of nowhere I turn my head and 2 of the kids are right behind me with the creepiest smile on their faces. I immediately go off the trail and find a spot as far from them as possible. Still on edge, I make my way back to camp and sit back down, and then all of us see those 2 kids walk back to their tent hand in hand at 3 in the morning. Scared the heck out of me. Then all of us see those 2 kids walk back to their tent hand in hand at 3 in the morning. Buddy system, yo. I consider myself a master outdoorsman. I have been camping, hunting, fishing, hiking my entire life and almost feel more comfortable out in the woods than I do in the city. We have the luxury of some of the best backpacking in the US where I live, tons of beautiful high mountain lakes, very few people, lots of wilderness. You get the idea. 2 years ago, my friend and I were backpacking up to one of the higher lakes on a 16-mile loop. We found a great spot to set up camp at the end of the day and started exploring to find a good fishing hole. Not more than 100 feet away from where we had set up camp, we see a white object sitting in the middle of the woods. We walked over to get a better look and lo and behold, it's a toilet. And not just a toilet, there is a wooden platform and a deep hole dug at the bottom. It was one of the coolest things I had ever seen out backpacking. How and why someone managed to lug a full-size toilet and plywood up that far is beyond me. We asked around if anyone knew about the origins of the mystery forest toilet, but no one seemed to. While not really creepy, it was definitely weird, especially given the proximity of the toilet to the lake. On a bad rain year, that toilet would be underwater, but it looked brand new and didn't smell at all. It was one of my most favorite dumps I have ever taken. No walls, no windows, just me sitting on the can staring at the lake hoping a bear didn't come up behind me and eat me. The best part of this story is that you actually used it. Huh? I walked straight into a ring-necked spitting cobra once. It reared up and we just kinda froze and stared at each for a moment. The snake then turned and went the other direction and I got my breath back, heart just stopped. One summer I was a camp counselor at a Girl Scout camp. I was in charge of the canoes. One day, we were going on a trip to this little island in the river. 2 canoes of girls, 2 canoes of counselors lifeguards. One of the other counselors sticks her paddle into the water and hits something within some of the weeds that's a bit stiff, so she looks close and see a freaking hand tangled up in the weeds. Needless to say, she was freaking out, but trying to not freak out so the kids wouldn't catch on. They were within eyesight but busy doing kids stuff. Some frantic whispering quickly filled all the adults in on what was going on and we decided to, well, just go ahead and go to the island and have lunch like we planned. Later that night when no kids were around, we came up with a plan to have people go out and check without kids the next day. Also, lots of talk of OMG, how could a body get out there? What if it's real? Lots of crazy hypothesizing. The next day we get out to the same spot, still see the hand sticking out of the weeds, and after some time pushing herself up to grab it, she does. Only to find out that it was an empty black industrial rubber glove. Pretty anticlimactic. Screw the kids, You should probably try to pull someone out if you find them underwater. Could have been a person drowning and already unconscious. This past summer I was working on a project monitoring amphibian larvae in vernal pools. Many of them were in the middle of wide expanses of state land largely unpatrolled. Technically with no public access but plenty of old logging roads and ATV trails people don't usually use for poetic strolls at sunrise through nature or birdwatching. I stumbled onto a lot of illegal dumps with weird things, sofas, construction equipment, hundreds of chew cans, baby clothes, not to mention plenty of abandoned camps hangouts for people to shoot up, plenty of disposed paraphernalia. But without a doubt the creepiest thing I found, while all alone about 5 miles from a paved road following only deer trails, was an upright, gently used baby stroller. There were toys in the storage areas, and a blanket still in the main area. I have a picture of it on an old phone. I just stood there and stared at it, like any moment something from the hills have eyes was about to step out from the woods. I've posted this story on Reddit in the past. I do night photography in the wilderness. When life gets too hectic I pack a bag and head out into the most remote county I haven't visited yet and hike until I find a spot I like. Very relaxing to be out alone in the middle of nowhere doing some night photography, enjoying fresh air and peace and quiet. I was on some BLM land in California in the desert. Had a nice evening, slept in, enjoyed breakfast and started to head back to the car. On the trail back, I see two heads with a makeshift campsite and jungle around. I hiked in another way. They see me approaching and I wave and say hi, being polite and hoping they mind their business. They don't. Both step onto the trail and begin to approach me. One pulls a knife. I immediately pull my revolver from the side of my pack, dong it and point it at them. Loudly, I tell them to back off. They leave the trail and I make my way past. While they give me a menacing look, I face them, backing away on the trail until the sightline vanishes. I then run to my car. When I get there I drive off and call the authorities about the incident. Glad you had the capacity to shoot more than film. Pink panties stuffed in a cow skull. Back when I was into Boy Scouting we would go on high adventure trips all the time. One year we went to the Black Hills in South Dakota and went on a mountain climbing expedition. The trail up to Honey Peak was pretty long and exhausting, though it wasn't terrifying. We found a broken concrete stair slab in the middle of nowhere, on a fricking mountain nonetheless. This was also at least 4 years before that SAR story from Paranoia even existed. Not a Boy Scout but I too go on high adventure trips. Some buddies and I did a road trip from Alberta to Alaska. At one point during the trip we went for a walk in this little abandoned gas station cafe. It was at least 400 km from any other town. We rounded a corner and my friend who was walking ahead of us turned and sprinted to the car. I looked around the corner to see a super rough looking man leaning against the wall of the building shaking with his back turned to us. It would have been neat to hear what his story was but at the time I had never run too fast. I would have rather come across a grizzly. I was camping in the Columbia Gorge and the next morning while me and my boyfriend at the time were making breakfast, 4 people came walking down the mountain wearing business suits. They were maybe 30 feet away and didn't even look at us as they walked past. That night a cop pulled up to our spot and told us that we had to leave because a lot of people go missing in that area. He stayed there while we packed up and followed us until we got to Hood River. Even though I experienced it, it still seems so out there that I hesitate telling that story because it sounds so ridiculous. Another time, I found a deer spine on a rope. That's just some organized crime mother suckers returning from a hit. On a camping trip a few years back a friend had brought some smoked venison for everyone. We heated it on the fire and all took part in what was a delicious meal but had quite a bit of meat left. After some heavy drinking and other avenues of getting as high as possible we all passed out assuming my friend had packed the leftover away for another day. He did not. In reality he took what was left and for some stupid reason threw it into the creek right beside our campsite. Around 4 AM I awoke to a screaming that appeared to be 2 wild animals fighting over food. Turned out that's exactly what it was. Like Noah's Ark, every animal from miles around had smelled the meat in the air, tasted the meat in the water, and tracked the meat to where we were. The eyes staring back at me from every direction I shined my flashlight was the creepiest thing I've ever seen in the woods. But technically they found me. I'll just mention that the dozens of times I have found clothes in the woods always freaks me out. Often women's or children's clothes. Why are they there? How did this happen? Really? Another pile in the woods? Who is hiking and leaving half-buried clothes in almost every nature area I've ever been to? If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.